Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and welcome back to Islamicate book reviews. We've been on hiatus actually for quite a while. Those of you who've been following us for a long time will know that I actually started a series with my friend and colleague at the University of Edinburgh, Omar Anchassi, called Islamicate book reviews, and he's been busy with
life.
with life and with getting on with research and publication. And as a consequence, alhamdulillah, you've actually published a couple of things since I think you left. Alhamdulillah, you've got another 4 weeks from today and going on for the next 3 weeks after this. We'll be able to enjoy your company and revive Islamic book reviews. And so we'd like to welcome everyone to a session where we will be discussing a book by another friend and colleague of mine from the US, Nebil Husayn's Opposing the Imam, the Legacy of the Nawasib in Islamic Literature. And as usual, inshallah, Omar will introduce the book for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll sort of go into a discussion for maybe half an hour, and then take questions towards the end. Omar has kindly suggested that we can go a bit over the hour with questions, so please do stick around till the very end. Inshallah, I've not done this yet, but I will give a link in the description on Facebook and YouTube to be able to buy the book, inshallah. And so please do stick around. You can sort of ask questions. They will come up for us as comments, and Omar and I will be happy to sort of engage you. But without further ado, please, Omar, take it away, inshallah.
Thank you. So please feel free to post your questions throughout the session. I can see we've already had some important comments that we could perhaps attend to if that's possible, Osama. So yes, this is Opposing the Imam, the Legacy of the Nawasib in Islamic Literature by Nebil Husayn. It's composed of an introduction, 6 body chapters, and a very brief afterward, as well as a few appendices. And you could say this book is, in some sense, really about the formation and crystallization of Sunni identity in the 8th and 9th centuries, although the author looks at texts ranging, for the most part, from the 8th to the 13th centuries in the genres of hadith, biography, and also kalam, as well as miscellaneous other items. And the author's contention, which I think he demonstrates persuasively, and I'll kind of unpack what he does in some of the chapters shortly, is that opposition to the Alids and to Ali, specifically in narratives against Ali, circulated widely in the early period. And especially from the 9th century onwards, many of these narratives and ideas and sentiments, many of which were attributed to respectable figures in the early Muslim community, were suppressed, amended, reinterpreted in a later period, and so on. So it's really a book about the emerging of this identity, particularly as it relates to the Alids. And he begins with the chapter Ali, a contested legacy. And this is a nice kind of programmatic chapter where he outlines the whole range of attitudes towards Ali and the Alids across various Muslim sects and groups and so on, ranging from, on the one hand, outright hostility to Ali on the part of pro-Umayyads, the more extreme and early, certainly the earlier Uthmanis, and the Zubayrids to some extent, all the way to those who deify Ali and view him as an incarnation of God, often referred to with the pejorative epithet of the ghulat or extremists. Also the Mufawwidah, because they God delegates his power to the imams and so on. But within these kind of 2 brackets or 2 extremes, you have a range of attitudes, and there are 6 in total, including the 2 we've just mentioned. You have those figures who deny any kind of particularly special place value, or they're quite against his veneration and deny the great majority of reports on his fada'il and manaqib and so on. A group that includes Ibn Taymiyyah, the subject of one chapter, also al-Bukhari, Ibn Hazm, and al-Firuz Ibadi, who dies in 817 of the Islamic era. And he does cite in the footnotes several times in the book Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, but at least in the first chapter, he doesn't identify him, strictly speaking, as far as I recall, as belonging to this group, but more or less you can put him there. So that's this particular group. They often revive kind of anti-Alid themes, especially in the anti-Shia writing. And they kind of, other Sunnis would say, especially pro-Alid Sunnis, go overboard perhaps in their denial either of these narratives or also their reservations about the caliphate of Ali. The third group is a more middle-of-the-road approach, one could say, that represents the great majorities of Sunnis historically. And these are those who deny the tafdeel of Ali. So they will say Ali is not the best of the companions or the best of people after the Prophet ﷺ. However, they recognize his virtues and so on to a much greater extent than group number two. Group number four are those who may accept the tafdeel of Ali and even the idea that he is the Prophet's legatee or wasi. However, they deny some of the, let's say, miraculous reports attributed to them, or those that assign to Ali certain kinds of supernatural knowledge or ability. So this would include groups like some of the early Imamis, certainly the Zaydis, and pro-Alid Sufis and Mu'tazila. So they deny that Ali had knowledge of alchemy and language, extra languages and these kinds of things. The fifth group are the kind of mainstream of the Imamis and the 12 Shia, those who accept Ali's imamate and his tafdeel, obviously, but reject his deification. And the sixth group, as we've mentioned, the Ghulat or the Mufawwida. So that's chapter one in a nutshell. Chapter two looks at Umayyads and Uthmani. So this chapter is very interesting and, like all of the book, engagingly written and well researched, but perhaps a bit disorganized. One could say Husayn looks at a range of figures in the early period: Da'ish ibn Zubair, Marwan ibn al-Hakam, Mughira ibn Shu'bah, Muawiyah, al-Ma'mun, al-Mutawakkil, and so on. And we can kind of revisit this later on, perhaps. And he kind of looks at the various attitudes attributed them towards Ali in the literature. Importantly, this is a chapter where he foregrounds this idea that he will bracket questions of historicity. So he's not interested in investigating, which would be a whole other venture and another book, really, whether these attitudes really belong to these figures. This is just the material that's attributed to them. And of course, you have a range of views, especially because as Sunni identity emerged and crystallized, there was, you could say, an interest in minimizing or reinterpreting the conflicts between the Prophet's companions. Third chapter is on Al-Jahiz and his views, focusing especially on his Risalat al-Uthmaniyya and Risalat al-Hakamain. And that's a really interesting chapter that builds on the work of many figures, but especially Asma Afsaruddin in her excellent book, Excellence and Precedence. I think he really adds a lot to Afsaruddin's presentation, and he tries to square the circle, because Jahid is quite slippery, and it's hard to actually know at times what he felt about these things, not uncommonly for Al-Jahid. The fourth chapter is, in some respects, the most interesting of the book, and the one from which both I and I think myself, Usama, based on our conversation earlier, learned the most from. Absolutely. The extremely interesting Ibadi figure from southern Algeria, Al-Warjalani, who dies in 570 or 1175 of the Common Era, based especially, and he cites other Ibadi histories and sources, based on his, this is, see if I can remember the title. Yes. Anyway, it will hopefully come to me afterwards. something al-uqul libaghi libaghi sabil. Anyway, it's a 3-volume treatise that addresses a whole range of subjects, refuting Ash'aris and 12 Shia and so on, but really a kind of miscellany containing or exploring many issues, including legal theory, kalam, and so on. Very interesting. And this chapter buttresses the idea expressed throughout the book that narratives, especially about early or sacred history, both kind of create and shape communal identities. So it's in that chapter that we see the early history of the Muslim community, but not as we know it, right? And that's endlessly fascinating. Hopefully we can both unpack that together, Osama. And then the chapter after that is on Ibn Taymiyyah, focusing, of course, on his famous, or should I say infamous, Minhaj al-Sunnah Nabawiyya. And this is an interesting chapter that kind of, it does add context. I would say it's somewhat more partisan in tone than the other chapters, and maybe if we have time, we can discuss that more. And finally, and afterward, a chapter on Ali and his rehabilitation in Sunni hadith and historiography. This is a chapter that's really full of detective work, really fascinating detective work, looking at how reports, using 7 strategies that the author names, reports were massaged, reinterpreted, amended, and a range of other techniques we can discuss in the course of rehabilitating Ali, minimizing this conflict between the Sahaba and so on. And finally, a very brief afterword that kind of reflects on all of these issues. So that's the book in a nutshell. And it's very engagingly written. I don't know if it's superficial to say this, but I also really like the color and the cover design. It's a very tasteful shade of green. Green, of course, being the color of al-Bayt. It's a book from which I learned a great deal. Not everything, of course, I agreed with, but that's to be expected, especially in writing on Ibn Taymiyyah, who's what the British would refer to as a Marmite figure. You either love him or hate him. But it's fair enough. In any case, that chapter is still full of interesting details.
I didn't get quite so far, but I wonder if you, what you thought of the appendices, because there are a couple of chapters which are...
Yes, so these are very useful material, mostly translations of, for instance, some of Ibn Taymiyyah's from Minhaj al-Sunnah. So really, really useful material and translation for, assigning to undergraduates, for example, in a course on, say, Shi'ism or Sunni Shia relations and so on.
Right. Okay, so, as I say, Nebil is someone who came into the doctoral program that I was at 1 year after me. So I got to know him around that time, and he's also, if it's okay for me to say, I suppose, he's also married to a Bengali, so he's an honorary Bengali, which makes sort of our relationship even more strong. But yes, so we used to.
I don't have the pleasure of knowing Nabil. I think we were once in the same room at Mesa, but that's about it.
Right. So yeah, it's been sort of a long time since I've seen him, unfortunately, because I've moved back to the UK as of 2015. But I was looking forward to reading this book. Unfortunately, I didn't get as far as you did. I've gotten to the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter, which is a longer chapter than the others. But as you said, I was really fascinated by the Warjalani chapter. It's just eye-opening, because I thought, this sort of historiography, I didn't realize we had access to. So it really, from the historical perspective, it's fascinating. And the fact that, for example, someone like Ibn Muljam, the stereotype is Imran ibn Hittan's comment about Ibn Muljam as, they're being praised for the killer of Ali, radiallahu anhu, among Khariji circles. But the Ibadis, of course, they take their genealogy from the Muhakkima, as they're called, but they distinguish themselves from the Kharijis, and this is why they've survived.
Yes, I should say he points to a range of attitudes on Ibn Muljam among Ibadis. Most do not praise him. for reasons such as, it may they're not sure whether he belonged to a more extremist Khariji group and whether he truly represents the views of the Muhakkam and so on. But you do find those like al-Barsawi, flourished in the 5th Hijri century, who do have a more positive attitude towards Ibn Mujab. So one of the main conclusions of the book, you could say, is that Sunnism is a very broad, I was about to say church, but tent. And the kind of traces of, if you look at, say, the Musnad Ahmad or a source like the Mu'jam of the Tabarani, because of the range and diversity of sources and ruwat or tradents, this translation that's now becoming very popular, you find hadith that are, anti-Alid, pro-Alid, pro-Umayyad, Uthmani, and so on. Ahmad's Musnad, he says, preserves literally hundreds of Kufan pro-Alid reports. And in subsequent centuries, and Nabil's various papers I've looked at kind of take this up, especially his fascinating paper on the literature on the salvation of Abu Talib. Right. In subsequent centuries, Sunnis have the option, in some sense, is always there. They can revive anti-Alid arguments and appropriate them. And then you have Sunnis who, on the other hand, kind of lean more towards the Alids, and he gives a number of examples of such figures in his work today. So, you find this, even Ali Jifri, and he mentioned in his article,
Ahmad ibn Siddiq al-Ghumari is sort of
famous or notorious, who writes a treatise on the salvation of on Najat Abu Talib and so on, Abi Talib. So you find these diverse tendencies and so on. That's very interesting. Since you raised it, I wonder if we should discuss Al-Warjalani first.
It's entirely up to you. I think it makes for an interesting discussion. As you say, it's, in a sense, in my estimation, and I've not finished the book yet, so I can't make a complete judgment, it's the freshest contribution, certainly for myself. I was completely unaware.
The final chapter is also really interesting, as I said, detective work on, especially the transmission history of reports, right. And how they underwent some kinds of emendation and so on in the process of the transmission. Now, Al-Warjalani, as I said, Ibadi figure from Warjalan in southern Algeria, Abu Ishaq Yaqub, contemporaneous with 3 other major Ibadi Warjalani figures, or 2 others rather, so he's the 3rd of them, and the last to pass away, I believe. He presents us with his book that Nabil supplements with other sources, with really the Ibadi historiography. So, to some extent, their different views are a reflection of and are shaped by their competing narrative of early history. Now, we may all be familiar with what happens between Ali and Muawiyah at Siffin in the year 37. And so Ali accepts arbitration with Muawiyah. Different sources report different possibilities in this regard. So some pro-Alid sources say that Ali was compelled to resort to arbitration or tahkim. Others say that he did so to avoid bloodshed and so on. In Ibadi sources, Ali was very willingly undertook or resorted to tahkim. Why? Interestingly, because he and Muawiyah had more or less agreed among themselves to respect their respective jurisdictions and to, Ali would keep Iraq and Muawiyah would keep Sham. And the Ibadi narrative is at this point, when Ali resorted to tahkim, this is when he became guilty of unbelief or kufr. Now, the weird thing is that, of course, we find these views very extreme, but Al-Warjalani and the Ibadi narrative overall actually comes across somewhat sympathetically. So, unlike other groups, the Ibadis, it seems, based on Nabil's presentation, are much less likely to generate kind of dubious reports about figures they don't like, such as Amr ibn al-As and Muawiyah. For them, it's enough to acknowledge that they were that they committed these various crimes and so on.
Can I add? I mean, in addition to that, and this is kind of, you could say, a stereotype within Ahl Sunnah in terms of hadith narration, but Ibadis consider lying to be a kabira, and so you're not going to go ahead and lie about sort of traditions going back to the Prophet, or historical traditions for that matter.
Yeah, so that's true, and the Ibadis are also very frank in acknowledging, and this really speaks to their, you could say, objectivity, interesting term, that they will even cite, he mentions, Ali in hadith and legal contexts. Why? Because for the Ibadis, both Ali and Muawiyah were righteous rulers when they came to power. So another aspect in which the Ibadi narrative differs from what one would expect to find, certainly among Sunnis, is that the general idea is that Uthman was killed, or most of the Muhajirs and Ansar agreed to his killing and kind of executed him for his obstinacy and refusal to recant. And that Ali was not physically involved in the killing, but along with other companions such as Talha Zubair and Ammar bin Yasir, who is a kind of key role model for the Ibadis, they kind of were active in organizing his killing in opposition to him. The Ibadis say the Sahaba divided into three groups over Uthman. Most of the Muhajirun Ansar, who said that his killing was a good thing and that he got what was coming to him, essentially. And then a group including Talha and Zubair, who said that Uthman, later said that Uthman had recanted and therefore didn't deserve to be killed. And finally, a group including Abdullah bin Umar and these others who famously abstained from participating in the violence. Although he notes that there are other Ibadi sources who are less kind to the abstainers, because Jalani generally says that all of these groups in principle are fine, but that some refer to Ibn Umar and others as Ahl al-Shak. So you have, even within a very, very tiny sectarian group like the Ibadis, you have a certain amount of diversity. Also, probably the last point I should make about how the Ibadi narrative diverges. Generally, of course, you have all kinds of divergences, even within the Sunni camp, and especially within the Sunni camp, I should say, about what exactly happened. In the Ibadi narrative, after the Muhakkama, later become known as the Khawarij, withdraw from Ali's camp and encamp at Harura, Ibn Abbas is sent to dialogue with them by Ali. And in the Ibadi narrative, unlike the Sunni one where he convinces some of the Muhakkama and gets them to withdraw, or to,
a significant number, right? Thousands in the
thousands.
Sunni,
I think 4,000 I've seen in other reports as well.
Yeah.
In the Ibadi account, actually they convince Ibn Abbas, who then refrains from fighting against them. So I mean, it really does make you sit back and reflect about communal identity and how this is tied to competing narratives of sacred history, and also the extent to which I think we take for granted a certain version of events. Although, as I've said, in Sunni sources, certainly there is, contradictory reports on these kinds of issues. So much for Al-Warud Jalani.
Just a quick question on Warud Jalani. I mean, I didn't get the impression. Certainly, Nabil doesn't mention isnads, and he's not looking at sort of historicity per se. For me, what would be an interesting question, however, because these people are basically from the 6th century Hijri, so I mean they're all from around the year 570, and for me the question is, well, that's a fascinating sort of line of historical inquiry to be had with respect to Ibn Abbas. Especially if, from a Sunni perspective, for example, that the Ibadis, as people who are broadly placed within Kharijism by Sunnis, are considered to be reliable transmitters. What's the reliability of that report? That would be a fascinating...
That would be an excellent question. Now, in terms of reliability, I mean, I should probably address now the final chapter, which, as I said, is full of fascinating detective work. So as Sunni identity kind of crystallizes, especially from the 9th century onwards, there is a general tendency among Sunni hadith scholars to minimize the tensions between the Sahaba, or to kind of read them very charitably, mistaken ijtihad and so on. And in the process of transmitting these reports, the more extreme elements are weeded out. So very overtly, Nasibi sentiments are discarded, as are extreme pro-Alid ones. But the kind of process of filtering out all of these elements is imperfect, in the sense that they leave traces that one can still find very easily today. Just by way of example, and many examples are given, especially in this final chapter. Even though both Sunni and Shia chapter sources report that Ali was given the name Abu, or the kind of kunya Abu Turab, by the Prophet ﷺ, Nabil does a good job of demonstrating that actually this probably arose originally as a pejorative epithet. Why? Because Umayyad did not want to recognize Ali as, so explicitly as a father of one of the Prophet's grandsons, Al-Hassan. So Abu Turab originated as a pejorative, and he kind of gives linguistic evidence for this. All of these taribat yadak phrases, for instance, in the hadith, taraba always has a negative connotation, he says, in the Arabic language and so on. But over time, this kind of underwent a certain amount of massaging, and there's evidence that some of the companions, or some of the kind of pro-Alid companions of Ali and so on, did not accept this designation of Abu Turab and viewed it as insulting. There are other examples one could give, less, shall I say, less invasive means of modifying reports. So, for instance, mere omission of problematic content. So, a report, for instance, in which specific accusations are leveled reportedly by Ali against Abu Bakr and Omar. And in reporting this narrative, it would be said that such and such is said about Abu Bakr, instead of naming specific accusations. It makes it less charged, you could say. Other examples, for instance, again, kind of omission or not naming particular figures. So he mentioned 7 strategies. I've kind of alluded to some of them. For instance, when Marwan ibn al-Hakam was governor of Medina, it's well known that he would, and widely reported that he would, insult Ali on the pulpit. And then in certain collections, it says that a governor of Medina would insult Ali on the pulpit and so on. And you have examples like this. One final example I want to give is something that Ibn Hajar interestingly picks up on. For example, a hadith that circulates in the early period, it clearly says, attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Talib and his family are no allies of mine. Now it circulates in later versions as Abu so-and-so and his family are no allies of mine. Now Ibn Hajar manages to find the original version where in a mustakhraj of Bukhari Sahih by Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, and he accepts this hadith, which seems to be clearly, pro-Umayyad, or at least anti-Alid. And he engages in one of the other 7 hermeneutical strategies, this kind of hermeneutical blunting of anti-Alid material. He says, well, this simply refers to the non-Muslim members of the Talibids. So you have all of these fascinating kind of strategies documented at some length in the final chapter. So for me, it's that final chapter and the Warud Jalani one that really open up new vistas and promising avenues for future research. And yeah.
Barakallahu feekum. Fascinating. I mean, I think I look forward to sort of reading the rest of the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter and the final chapter, as you mentioned, to be able to get that overview. I had a sort of series of questions of my own, I suppose, which are to a certain extent, the entire topic of Nasb is uncomfortable for Sunnis, as it is uncomfortable for the Shia. I mean, that's why this is quite an interesting work, because it's bringing out something which nobody wanted to preserve, right? No one's interested in it. They don't like it. And I sort of wonder, in a sense, there are certain elements of this, just the example that you mentioned a moment ago, shifting Marwan ibn al-Hakam to a governor of Medina. I mean, is Marwan ibn al-Hakam considered a Sahabi, or was he a Tabi'i? I can't, because I think he continued to live in Ta'if or something like this during the lifetime of the Prophet, even though he may have accepted Islam or something.
He's a bit of a shady figure.
Mukhadram or something like that, right?
Yeah, something like this, if I'm not mistaken.
And I mean, basically the Earl of Abi Sufyan are, where a lot of these contests are most vigorous. I mean,
yes.
Ibn Taymiyyah has this unusual sort of status in trying to, I think, even give someone like Yazid a charitable reading.
Yes. So I think now would be an excellent opportunity to discuss the Ibn Taymiyyah chapter. So specifically on the point about Yazid, Husayn points out that there was a tradition, as I said, Sunnism is a broad tent, but you find fatwa and comments against the cursing of Yazid by figures like Al-Ghazali, Ibn al-Salah, Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi, and his teacher, somebody al-Harbi, whose first name eludes me. And al-Harbi, who was a teacher of Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi, was refuted by Ibn al-Jawzi, who was a famous treatise on the subject of the cursing of Yazid. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, his view on Yazid is that, and something you find reported in the historical literature, but I've always found very far-fetched, that he grieved when he heard of the death of al-Husayn, which is somewhat difficult to believe. But then he says that most of the reports against him are fabrications by the Ghulat, and that he, in fact, certainly that's true to some extent. You find these entertaining but ridiculous reports with Yazid, racing a monkey mounted on a cheetah or a leopard or something like this, and reports that him and the Umayyads would mourn the deaths of the family of Abu Sufyan at Badr. Somewhat difficult to credit that they would do so publicly, or that they would shoot the Quran full of arrows. And this, now, it's I think sensible to be skeptical about some of this. But he
reports that who would mourn the family of?
Well, Yazid and the other Umayyads. The idea that they were, distraught by, and many years later would mourn their relatives killed at Badr as pagans by the Prophet ﷺ.
Right.
Which is
so those are the sorts of things potentially fabricated by the Ghulat, as you say. Yeah.
This is Ibn Taymiyyah has a broader view, though. He says that Yazid never committed. He didn't drink wine. He didn't deprecate religion, and he didn't commit an offense for which one would normally receive a had punishment. Now, certainly, and there are interesting parallels, by the way, between some of the arguments of Al-Jahiz in Risalat al-Uthmaniyya and Ibn Taymiyyah in Minhaj al-Sunnah. So to give some context about Minhaj al-Sunnah, which Husayn points out he says one of the most comprehensive. I would be surprised if it was not the most comprehensive kind of anti-Shi'i polemic in the Sunni tradition, in the same way Jawab Sahih is, I believe, the most comprehensive refutation of Christianity in the whole Muslim tradition. This is what Thomas Michel says, as far as I recall. So a large multi-volume work. And what is the context in which it is generated? For the first time since the Buyids, Husayn points out, were Shi'i dynasty, with the conversion of the Mongol Ilkhan Olyatu, who reigns from 1304 to 1316, and makes Shi'ism the state religion of the Ilkhanids. A number of his courtiers and military commanders convert with him, although he retains a Shafi'i chief justice for some bizarre reason. He invites Al-Allama al-Hilli, the well-known scholar, author of Shara' al-Islam, to become his personal tutor and spiritual counselor and so on. So what happens in 1309, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, Al-Hili writes for him a series of 3 works of varying length, kind of outlining and defending the 12 Shi'i views on the imamate. And the shortest of these 3 works, Minhaj al-Karama fi Ma'rifat al-Imama, is the target of Ibn Taymiyyah's refutation in Minhaj al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyya fi Naqd Kalam al-Shi'a al-Qadariyya. So it's a large multi-volume work, and Husayn's contention is that it really kind of revives some of these anti-Alid themes. Now, he points out, well known in Ibn Taymiyyah's lifetime, that he was criticized by his Sunni peers for anti-Alid sentiment. Including, and Tufi reports this via Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and many subsequent figures, some of whom were much less well informed about Ibn Taymiyyah's actual position, such as Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, really make a kind of
big deal
discuss this at great length. Now, I would say this chapter is somewhat more partisan than the others. Why? And I recognize that Ibn Taymiyyah is an immensely divisive figure, to understate the case somewhat, because in the other chapters, including the one on Warad Jalani, Husayn's concern is really to just present the arguments and analyze them and so on. But in the chapter on Ibn Taymiyyah, my sense, and I may very well be mistaken on this, is that he even engages in refuting him to some extent, certainly a much greater extent than is the case with, say, the chapter on Al-Warad Jalani. And Al-Warad Jalani is the one who accuses Ali of being a kafir and doomed to hell and what have you. Anyway, and also elsewhere in the book, Husayn brackets the question of historicity. But when it comes to engaging Ibn Taymiyyah and challenging some of Ibn Taymiyyah's views, he seems to take for granted the historicity of certain events, including relating to the rebellion of Al-Husayn. So he says, well, Ibn Taymiyyah can't be right that Al-Husayn would have been better to just stop fighting and to stay in Medina, what have you, because his ambassadors were killed by the governors of Kufa and Basra and all of these other things. So, without accepting the historicity of these narratives, one cannot reach that conclusion. So it seems somewhat contradictory to Nabil's kind of general view. But anyway, finally, by way of disagreement, there are certain, I think, very clear misinterpretations. And I'll just suffice myself with one example, because I also want to discuss the really interesting chapter on Al-Jahiz, which is a major contribution. Sometimes the texts are read in a way that makes Ibn Taymiyyah seem more anti-Alid than he is. And others may disagree with this. So one example, he mentions Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's point that, he read Ibn Hajar Sunnah Nabawiyya, he wasn't very happy with it because Ibn Taymiyyah, according to Ibn Hajar, rejects on the Fada'il and Manaqib of Ali many reports which he characterizes as jiyad. Jiyad being the plural of jayyid, which Nebil Husayn translates as first rate. Now, people familiar with hadith terminology will spot this as a mistake, because a jayyid hadith in hadith kind of criticism is one that is acceptable or good. It is not sahih. It is not, unimpeachable. So Ibn Hajar is saying that, I think there is some difference between saying Ibn Taymiyyah rejects first-rate, unimpeachable reports on the Fada'il of Ali versus saying that he rejects reports that are kind of acceptable or good and don't really have any problems with their isnads. It's a difference of degree, certainly, rather than one of kind. But it is a really interesting chapter, especially in contextualizing Ibn Taymiyyah's Minhaj al-Sunnah. I'm sure there is, you could write a great thesis on that book for sure. There's not a huge amount of certainly English language scholarship on it. And he also draws interestingly on the work of Tariq al-Jamil, whose book I was waiting for some years to materialize. Hopefully it will appear. I assume he's citing the thesis version of it on Sunni Shia relations, especially in the 12th and 13th and 14th century. So we await that exciting piece of work. Now on Al-Jahiz, again, we've noted some of these parallels or alluded to some of these parallels between arguments of Al-Jahiz and Ibn Taymiyyah. Al-Jahiz is the first source we know of to venture some of these arguments. So, what is he trying to do? He is.
Sorry, I disconnected for a moment. I hope it was okay. You can continue.
So in Risalat al-Uthmaniyah, Al-Jahiz is basically trying to discredit all of the arguments that would make Ali superior to Abu Bakr, to the extent that sometimes he will even, some would say similar kind of technique in Ibn Taymiyyah, he would even undermine Ali's caliphate, for instance, by saying that whereas in the previous three caliphates, the conquests continued apace, during the caliphate of Ali, the Muslims were preoccupied with civil war and the conquest ceased. So, if you're an author who's trying to make the argument that, even if you, as Ibn Taymiyyah does, and as Al-Jahiz Husayn argues, even though they accept the validity of Ali's caliphate and say that he is the fourth best of the companions and so on, position comment, it's a view known as Tarbi', making Ali the fourth, which he says, following Scott Lucas, is a 9th century Uthmani kind of development. I think I would have to revisit that to assess this claim, whether it's accurate or not. I suspect it emerged earlier than this. He doesn't discuss our favorite book, Kitab al-Ta'rikh. But anyway, now, so in these arguments, he's basically trying to demonstrate the superiority of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and the Uthmaniyah. How, for instance, people will say, well, Ali was the first person after Khadijah to convert, or something like this. Al-Jahiz will respond by saying, well, actually, there are contradictory reports. Some say Abu Bakr did it before him. And in any case, Ali was a child when he converted, and childs do not have taklif, or do not possess this quality of moral, ethical, legal responsibility, and so on. So his conversion is not meaningful like Abu Bakr, who was an adult, certainly at the time. And also that Ali was protected by Abu Talib, so he wasn't risking everything by converting in the way that many early companions were, especially the slaves and the vulnerable among them, for example. So this is a kind of argument that's mentioned. It's a really interesting work, and I mean, I first came across the Uthmaniyah when reading Asma of Saruddin's Excellence and Precedence, and it shows Al-Jahiz as a kind of master dialectician. Now, Al-Jahiz, for those used to him, is a very slippery figure. Why? Because he wrote a lot that was very tongue-in-cheek and would sometimes present views that he claimed did not represent his own and so on. So some of the points he makes in Risalat al-Uthmaniyah, he explicitly contradicts in Risalat al-Hakamain, for example, on Ali's juristic acumen. So he kind of plays this down in the Uthmaniyah while recognizing it very clearly and recognizing Ali's caliphate as a just and virtuous one in the Risalat al-Hakamain. Final point on Al-Jahid's view. So Al-Jahid, Nabil says, based especially on the Hakamain, and he has another treatise on the Zaydis that Nabil discusses. Al-Jahid is both Uthmani and to some extent, like his patron Al-Ma'mun, pro-Alid. Now, in the 9th century, 3rd century of the Islamic era, it is possible to sustain this kind of tension, if you like, because the Uthmanis themselves have kind of moderated their views over time, I suppose one could say. So this is Al-Jahid in a nutshell.
But he, I can't remember, I wasn't reading the footnotes closely, which text he was referencing, but Jahid as a dialectician, and this is the difficulty in identifying exactly what he thinks, tries very deliberately to present as strong an argument on behalf of those he strongly disagrees with.
Yes,
so and this is try and refute that set of arguments.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, Al-Jahid writes these works of mufakharat, kind of rivalry and boasting matches, and other works like his famous Risala fil Qiyan, Epistle on Seeing Girls, translated by Beeston, where you're never, he often has all these disclaimers like, oh, these wicked people say, and then he'll present a view which you kind of suspect is his own view. But he's difficult to pin down. But I think Nabil does a wonderful job of squaring the circle, as it were, and pinning down, insofar as it's humanly possible, what position Al-Jahiz was actually advocating. Now, Al-Jahiz's patrons, Al-Ma'mun was clearly pro-Alid, right, in the year 211 and again in 212. He promulgates Tafdeel Ali as orthodoxy, religious orthodoxy, versus Al-Mutawakkil, who kind of ends the mihna and so on, right, who it seems resented Ali and the Alids to some extent. Yeah.
Right, Barakallahu feekum. And apologies, my computer literally crashed, and it's wonderful that StreamYard continued despite that. So I may have missed a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask maybe about specific. Well, actually, there are a whole host of questions that have come in from the viewers, and we will turn to those in just a moment, questions and comments in some cases. But I wanted to ask with respect to this is a conversation I had with Nabil actually a very long time ago in Princeton. And it was interesting for me to see his response to this comment of mine as being, oh, that's a sort of scurrilous accusation made about Al-Hasan. The fact that he married so many times, right? I mean, there are reports, Nabil mentions here in the hundreds, but you have reports of dozens, you have reports of 70 or more. Yeah. And I mentioned that Al-Dhahabi mentions this and said that Ali stood in the square of Kufa and said, don't marry your daughters to my son, because he will simply divorce them.
Yes, he's al-mitlaq, I think.
فَإِنَّهُ مِطْلَقٌ. I mean, that's the phrase he used. Yeah. And Nabil was like, these are sort of accusations leveled. And what struck me is when Al-Dhahabi is mentioning something like this, it's and other people in the Sunni tradition, it doesn't strike me as something which is derogatory. It's a bit unusual. It's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. One also finds this charge in Ibadi sources as well, of course. And for Ibadis, Al-Hasan is a problematic figure because he kind of cedes the caliphate to Muawiyah, and they say he basically accepted bribes to refrain from asserting his right to the imamate.
I mean, they're not literally saying that. They're saying that, the things that he would, as I recall, and you can correct me, that the things that he was given functioned as bribes. Is that what you're saying?
Well, for their bodies, I mean, I don't think there's a distinction. Okay. But yeah, I mean, Sunnis would probably not view it for Sunnis, it's all to do with actually he reconciling the Muslim community and so on. As for the historicity of those reports, I think that's difficult to know, and it's not really something I've looked into. But relevant to that point, Husayn does mention Muta. So, of course, I think in Bukhari Sahih, right, there's a hadith reported from Ali that Muta was forbidden on the day of Khaybar, along with meat of domestic donkeys. In other sources, however, one finds attributed to Ali, most famously, I think, to Ibn Abbas as well, Jabir bin Abdullah. And he mentions Ibn Jurayj, also mentions reports of companions who permitted Mut'a and seemingly continue to permit Mut'a. Now, I'm always skeptical of reports that such and such a companion or tabi'i recanted of holding this problematic, quote-unquote, viewpoint. And we often find reports of this nature, or Al-Hasan al-Basri recanted of his views on Qadr and all of this stuff. I mean, I think Ibn Abbas certainly, I haven't looked into Ali, but Ibn Abbas certainly did permit Mut'a and continue to do so. And even this famous remark attributed to al-Awza'i, where he says, don't go to the Hijazis, or maybe he says the Meccans, for their view on, and he picks out of the different Amsar and Muslim cities and says, don't follow these people on this, don't follow these people on this.
Yeah.
And I think it's the Madanese on singing and music, and the Meccans on Mut'a, and the Kufans on Nabid and so on.
So yeah, I mean, I really think that has historicity. Now, Nabil actually says that, well, if muta is not a problem, then why is it a problem that Al-Hasan is marrying dozens of women? I mean, you can marry for a certain time and then the marriages end and so on.
I didn't catch that particular line, so perhaps I need to have that chapter again. I mean, what's interesting is that sort of practice is also narrated from the person from whom we have the Thulathiyat of al-Bukhari. I forget his name, Makki ibn Ibrahim. It's narrated that he married 100 women, for example.
Yeah.
So
there are different ways of viewing this, and this goes back to the conversation we had in Michael Knight's fascinating book on the body of the Prophet ﷺ. So one could actually view this, I mean, obviously today this is not a very popular view, as a sign of virility and masculinity and so on.
Sure.
And there's no reason why his followers wouldn't necessarily have interpreted it this way instead.
Right. I mean, the thing is, to skip to the 20th century, Ibn Saud famously boasted that he had deflowered 300 virgins. Right. And this was very unusual in his context, but for him it was a source of pride and so on. I'm sure he has many children as well. Yes, I mean, he has
not in any way to compare these figures, of course.
Right. I mean, but in a sense, these were the sorts of things that I think rulers, male rulers, naturally would have sort of taken pride in historically, and sensibilities shift dramatically over time. Sure. So there are a couple of questions and a few comments. Samina Awan gives a kind comment, so I'll start with that, just saying that Salam's always good to watch both of you witnessing Islamic knowledge towards a meaningful debate among the younger generation. So I mean, and she's described you as a source of inspiration. I think it's important to have in these sorts of discussions a certain level-headedness, especially, of course, in our own times when there's a lot of sectarianism, unfortunately. Although, in a sense, in that connection, I wanted to ask you, are there sort of any measured histories on these sorts of periods? That's the challenging thing, because
that's the $64,000. That's the $64,000 question. I think Nabil actually gives an excellent answer to this, which is that there are no neutral narratives.
Right.
Because and often one might assume that certain reports in the Sunni tradition are the kind of the neutral ones, but really there are no neutral narratives, especially when it comes to events like this. Now, my own belief, which I mean, based on kind of preliminary, reading and this kind of thing, not something I've really sat down and looked at length, is I don't think one can ever reconstruct the exact events that happened in this case. Right. I think we can have a broad sense of what happened, but of course this is to a great extent a problem of the sources and all of these contradictory reports. But on the other hand, even if we were to take a time machine and travel all the way back, if we were to ask the different actors involved what they thought, they would still give us contradictory views. So
they'd have radically different interpretations.
Yeah. I mean, in some way, there's really no way around this, and this is why one among many reasons why we must avoid kind of sectarianism and so on. And I mean, these differences are with the Ummah. They've been with the Ummah as long as there's been such a thing, after the Prophet's death, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they won't be resolved until the Day of Judgment. So, whichever theologian comes forward claiming to have the knockdown argument about, the tafdeel of Ali or, the Imam of Abu Bakr, I mean, we're never going to resolve that argument, as interesting as it is.
My impression is that, to a certain extent, this we've discussed in the past as well, especially in the session on Michael Muhammad Knight's book, that the Sunni tradition in a sense tries to include as many people under its umbrella as possible, and doesn't necessarily try and square the circle, doesn't necessarily try and say, okay, well, we're including you and we're including you and this is how you have to reconcile your positions. No, actually they might not be able to, and they might hate each other, but they'll say, okay, we're still sort of like
and
Muslim or something like that. Yeah.
And the hadith critics, I sense, people like Al-Dhahabi were very aware of this, that there were very anti-Alid narrators
and also Shi'i narrators in the Sunni Hadith corpus, like well-regarded narrators, I mean.
Right.
Another figure he cites whose work we're also looking forward to is Michael Dan, who I think was also a colleague of yours at Princeton, who looks specifically at Shi'i narrators in the Sunni Hadith corpus, I believe. This will be another major kind of contribution.
Yeah, I sort of await his book. I don't know if it's going to be published imminently or anything like that, but
I don't know.
So Michael Dan's work, of course, is, as you said, like Shi'i narrators in the Sunni tradition. So I mean, there are interesting sort of opportunities, I think, in the modern period to try and explore some of these questions. And in a sense, by having this kind of like a Western hegemonic context in which, for the centers of knowledge and centers of learning in these countries, these are not sort of high stakes debates. These are sort of like Islamic studies is a low stakes sort of subject for, as a scholar once told me, the reason why people are so passionate about arguments in these sorts of academic debates is because the stakes are so low.
Yes, this remark attributed to Kissinger.
Interesting.
The reason, what is it? So debates, he says something like the debates are so, visceral in academia because the stakes are so low. But of course, this isn't the case. I mean, for us and for the author as well, I mean, it's so much more than that.
Absolutely.
And this is a book that I think, can be enjoyed by a general reader. It's very accessibly and engagingly written.
Deliberately so. Yeah.
Deliberately so. And hopefully it comes out in paperback soon, so people can, don't have to remortgage their house.
In addition to that, I would say though that as a Sunni reader, and I've known Nebil for a very long time, but there were sort of like parts of this where I was like, oh, that doesn't read very nicely. But this is just everyone's got their own sort of backgrounds and their reasons, I suppose, for sort of holding the views that they hold. And
yes.
Those are separate questions which he's, for the most part, as you've said, and on his intention at least is to bracket a lot of those questions and just trying to do the digging up the various strategies and the historical approaches that one witnesses.
But I'd again underline this point he makes, especially in the afterword, that there are no neutral narratives, and these narratives inform and are informed by communal identities.
Right.
And that over time these things shift, especially in the formative period, but to some extent even today. So he says Sunnism is this equation that to this day continues to involve this contain multitudes, as the poet would say, right? And he's figures like Hassan al-Saqaf and this what's his name, the one in Saudi who I believe has been detained.
Hassan ibn Farhan al-Maliki.
Yes, that's the guy. And even to some extent with the Ghumaris. I mean, it's Ahmed al-Ghumari he mentions, who accuses Bukhari of being anti-Alid, and so on. I mean, there's a question by John that I have.
Yes, so let me sort of share that now, if that's okay. So this is fairly early on. This sounds like a very interesting book. My question is, how is the all-famous conflict between Ali and Muawiyah central to the Sunni-Shi'i polemics treated as a meta-theme across these Nawasib groups? Does the author try and sketch out an objective historical account? I think to a certain extent you've...
Yeah, so I mean, he largely brackets questions of historicity. Yeah. I should say that, like many other labels, Mujassim and so on in Islamic theology, Nasibi is a pejorative epithet, and it is mostly unlikely that any one group would actually identify as Nasibi, unless... it's a bit like, feminist movements and LGBT movements that kind of ironically appropriate terms of slander. We find examples of this. Queer was initially a term of abuse and so on. So maybe there was some of that going on. But for the most part, and there's no one Nasibi group in the heresiographical literature, you could say. So Nasib, or the kind of anti-Alid sentiment, is a sentiment you find held by groups like the Umayyads and their supporters, especially by the early Uthmanis or the more radical Uthmanis, Zubayrids and so on to some extent, and their later supporters. So it is kind of more a sentiment or an impulse
rather than a sect, if you like.
Right.
So I should say, this brings to mind one important point I omitted to mention. So he does define nasb, and the antonym of nasb is rafd, if you like, so rejecting the companions, especially the two sheikhs. And he distinguishes between nasb and khilaf and taqsir. And
is this in the last chapter? I don't know.
This is in I believe it's in the first, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, yeah. But anyway, so what is nasb is kind of this anti-alad sentiment. Khilaf is, you may perfectly well respect Ja'far as-Sadiq, but you disagree with his legal opinions, for example. Taqsir is, again, kind of a sectarian charge in the sense that the ghulat will level the accusation of taqsir, not affording the imams their due right against the imamis. The imamis will level that charge against the Sunnis, and so on. So you have these three kind of interrelated but distinct phenomenon that Nabil kind of highlights and distinguishes.
Right. I had a question on the tip of my tongue and it's gone now. Subhanallah. I had another question which I sort of wanted to ask more generally, which I have noted down, which is the question of sort of accusing figures like Bukhari of potentially engaging in nasb and things like this. Of course that's something which it's a matter of to a certain extent it can be considered subjective whether something is considered nasb or not. I suspect. Yeah, because by the time of Bukhari, I think we already have a crystallized. This is the post Imam Ahmad sort of mihna period. We already have a crystallized strong position within what can probably be called the Sunnis quite clearly at that point.
Yeah,
nasb is rejected.
Yeah, so Nabil cites this accusation against al-Bukhari by the way of Ahmed al-Ghumari. Now, why does Ghumari? I think it's Ahmed, not Abdullah, if I remember right.
Yeah, it is Ahmed.
Ahmed. So Ahmed is a pro-Alad Sunni for sure. Right. And what is his accusation? He says that Bukhari has deliberately omitted the great majority of hadith on the Fada'il and Manaqib of Ali from his Sahih. Right. He does mention three key reports, among others, but the three well-known ones are the hadith of al-Manzila, you are like me, you're like Aaron was to Moses, except that there's no prophet after me. Yeah. And the famous hadith of Khaybar, when the prophet says, tomorrow I'm going to give command of, this battle to someone who, loves God and God loves him, and so on. And a third one that currently escapes me, but like Ibn Taymiyyah, he recognizes these reports and accepts them as authentic. Oh, and the hadith of Ghadir, right? So the Mawla, and so on.
Is that in Bukhari or?
Good question.
Yeah, I think there was another one. That's in some of the other 6 books. I seem to not recall that. It's canonical, but it's not in Bukhari.
Yeah, so interesting. So Ibn Taymiyyah also accepts these hadiths, but blunts them hermeneutically. So like Al-Jahiz, he would say, well, sure, the hadith of the Mawla is correct. And widely reported by Sunni and Shi'i sources, this Ghadir, and the Prophet is returning from his final pilgrimage, and then at this oasis, so on, claims Ali is his Mawla, and so on. And whoever's is Mawla, and so on. So Ibn Hazm, interestingly, unlike Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Jahiz, I believe, Ibn Hazm says there's no Sahih isnad for this report, which, even if it were true, is somewhat besides the point because it's so widely reported. You could say it has the status of tawatur in both Sunni and Shi'i books. And whole works have been dedicated to Hadith al-Ghadir, like multi-volume works tracing its various versions. Now, also, Ibn Taymiyyah would say, for example, again, an example of this hermeneutic blunting Nabil discusses at length, that, okay, so, even if we say that,
or how does Ibn Taymiyyah, how the Al-Jahiz, reinterpret the hadith of Aaron, hadith al-Manzila? They would say, well, the similarity between the Prophet ﷺ and Moses and Ali and Harun is that the Prophet left Ali when he went off to Tabuk, to that particular expedition, in charge of Medina. So in the same way that Moses left Aaron in charge of his dependents and the Israelites when he went up to meet his Lord, and also they were blood relatives, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah would say, okay, that's the similarity this hadith is pointing to.
Right.
And Shia and others would say no, and pro-Alids would say actually that's not the case at all. It's much stronger than that.
Yeah. I mean, you can point to the fact that Harun was basically a prophet, and
was a
there's
prophet,
no prophet after me. But
exactly, I mean that's a big deal, right? But in kind of countering these Shia arguments, Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Jahiz kind of pushing the other direction, and blunt them.
So, I mean, I think it's interesting that, as you say, you have this broad range within sort of Sunnism, and you have figures like Ahmad ibn Siddiq al-Ghumari, and you have figures like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hazm. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi is someone who would have, I've not read al-Awasim min al-Qawasim, but really often gets picked up on this. I don't know if it's been discussed in the secondary literature extensively. To be honest.
That's a good question. I'm not really aware of extensive discussions of him. I'm bits here and there. So he's cited a couple of times in the footnotes, although, I mean, he has this very famous remark that many subsequent Sunnis, even those who want especially pro-Alid, condemned, which is that Al-Husayn was killed with the sword of his grandfather, meaning what? And this, very widely criticized, rightly so. The idea being that, he rebelled and the Prophet taught not to rebel, and therefore he kind of brought his death upon himself, which is a very strange view.
I wonder what his doctrines are on the question of rebellion. I mean, like, it would seem to suggest that the other Qadi Abu Bakr, who always I have a tendency to mix up with Ibn al-Arabi, is Al-Jassas al-Razi, who famously in his Ahkam al-Quran, both of them have written Ahkam al-Quran as well. That's why I keep on confusing the two. But Al-Jassas, of course, is, I think, notable for pointing out, well, actually, it's perfectly legitimate to rebel.
As a Mu'tazili Hanafi, this is a fairly typical position. He even mentions the view that based on dubious hadith, if you must kill tax collectors, people who collect extra canonical taxes, like unlike the zakah and the khums and the kharaj and so on, you must kill them without warning, and all of this, which is very entertaining. Michael discusses this a bit in his book.
But I assume that Ibn al-Arabi is not someone who's sympathetic to the rebellion. Okay,
no, I mean, even Ibn Taymiyyah, he discusses Ibn Taymiyyah's view on Husayn's rebellion, which he says the kind of Ibn Taymiyyah's view is presented by Nabil as the wiser companions, such as Abdullah bin Umar. He refrained from all of this fitna and so on. And Ibn Taymiyyah, Nabil says, kind of ignores or underplays the agency of Al-Husayn, because he gives the impression very much that Al-Husayn was misled by the Kufans, and that it wasn't he didn't really choose to do it and was sucked into it, which is not very persuasive.
Once again,
but Ibn Taymiyyah, to some extent, you could say he's doing this as someone who's part of the mainstream of the Sunni tradition, is a quietist. Now, if later Sunni views emerge condemning rebellion as wrong, then, I mean, you could say a logical consequence of that is them taking issue with the rebellion of Al-Husayn. That is a kind of view that emerges later. But anyway.
I mean, so let me ask you two questions in that connection. And again, I understand we've gone over time a bit. I'm happy to, inshallah, bring this to a conclusion quite soon. But with respect to the question of rebellion, I mean, I think Khalid al-Fadl makes a rather persuasive point about sort of the so-called quietism doctrine, in as much as, if the doctrine is to recognize a usurper who has managed to take control, that's not actually a quietism doctrine in any real sense, because that's literally a legitimation of a rebellion, right? So, I can accept that, in a sense, the Sunni position, and this is something I argue in my forthcoming book, if you don't mind the plug, is that that rebellion is actually prohibited unless it's successful, right? That's the Sunni position, and so I think retrospectively.
So you better hope your rebellion succeeds.
Well, I mean, yes. But in that respect, retrospectively, you can say, oh, Hussein shouldn't have, and there are all these signs, etc.
Yeah.
But the point,
I fundamentally disagree with this idea anyway. And even if he was doomed from the outset, I mean, his death is about so much more than contesting power against the Umayyads. It's this kind of tremendously symbolic event that's continued to resonate down the centuries, and it's in some respects, a work, not Michael Knight's book on Muhammad's body, ﷺ, but in some of his other more imaginative work, he said, well, the story of Al-Husayn is, and he's not trying to trivialize it anyway, would be perfect material for like a spaghetti Western. Why? Because you have the story of, and it's a great narrative, on the narrative level, right? It's a great story. Why? A brave hero, hopelessly outnumbered, hopelessly, against the odds and all of this, confronts a tyrant and loses. But that's not to say his loss isn't deeply meaningful, right? It's and I'm sure you can find dozens of movies with a similar theme. I mean, Will Smith's I Am Legend, right? In the end, he kind of blows himself up. Anyway, I'll not go.
right.
But it's a deeply meaningful narrative that tugs at the heartstrings. Whether the fact that the rebellion is defeated, at least in the short term,
right.
Of course, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi and so on causes havoc afterwards, is not, I think, the key thing here, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of making a sort of a legal sort of retrospective interpretation, trying to make sense of what someone like Ibn Taymiyyah is trying to do. But yes, I mean, the thing is, that event in Islamic history, the death of Hussein radiallahu anhu, is such a traumatic experience for everyone involved except the Umayyads, or if you believe Ibn Taymiyyah, even the Umayyads, right? Yeah, I mean, it's so there are layers of it's one of the great challenges actually for Sunnism as well in its early history. It becomes this sort of seed for all sorts of ways of all sorts of developments in the Shi'i tradition, of course, in its various diverse manifestations.
Yes. Finally, I should say, when teaching about the fitna between the companions in class for, say, early history classes, I mentioned all this stuff about contradictory narratives and the problems of the sources and sectarianism. I mean, I think the best way to view it is to explain, especially to people who don't have a background in this history, that it's basically a trauma, like a really, really big trauma. Say a very acrimonious divorce of one's parents when one is a child.
Right.
And people respond to trauma in different ways. Some people will suppress it and deny it ever happened. Some people will. So there are all of these different responses. I think that's a helpful way to teach about it.
Fascinating, yes. So I guess this is my final question, which is, because you've commented periodically about, okay, I find this sort of historically plausible, this not so much, etc. What have you read to familiarize yourself with this period, both primary and secondary literature?
That's too big.
Obviously very vast,
there's a lot of lots of historical sources. Tabari is well known, Baladuri to some extent, and Yaqubi. I mean, any early historical work will cover these events.
But the challenge, of course, with these historical works is that there is so much contradiction. And also, what do we do with someone like Saif ibn Umar from, so much of this is narrated and
he's discussed in Nabil's book as a kind of, so he's a Kufan Uthmani, somewhat moderate in that he puts most of the blame on Ibn Saba, this mysterious figure. Sean Anthony has this book, The Caliphate and the Heretic, really on. But so he does acknowledge that Ali had some faults, but really he deflects most of the blame to this curious figure, Ibn Saba. So
does
Saif bin Umar,
Anthony think that he exists? Was he a historical figure, or?
He's mostly legendary, but the problem is, Ibn Saba also exists in Shia sources as well. Khalid Blankenship has a paper on Saif bin Omar where he basically says, this is what Sunni Hadith critics say about him, you could say,
Right.
that he's a liar and a storyteller and a fabricator. But Tabari uses him as an historical source. But he of course wasn't the only one engaged in this sort of fanciful storytelling activity. It was very common.
Interesting. Right. Actually, let me ask another question, if you'll forgive me. I'm just sort of like picking your brain at this point. So yeah, Tabari uses him, but how are we to interpret that? Potentially, Tabari's ambition is to write this universal history, and he's going to use whatever sources he has at his disposal. Yeah. This is one of the things about the way in which the Proto-Sunnis approached this entire issue was, we're not going to talk about it. And so, at least that's the impression one gets. And so,
yeah, that's a very important strand among Sunnis. Yeah.
And so, it's narrated from I think Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Those are tilka dima'un tahara Allahu biha suyufuna fala nulattikhu biha alsinatana.
Yeah.
And so we avoid talking slanderously about people in the past, but then that forces sort of historians to depend on people like Saif ibn Umar, who, as you mentioned, Khalid Blankenship points out, everyone thinks is a liar. So yeah, it's just I get the impression, and I don't know if you've read Najm Haydar's work. I just saw a lecture of his once. He was basically saying
his first book. I haven't read the more recent book, but right, I've read on myself. Yeah. I need to sit down and read it. Yeah.
But he once gave a lecture in Princeton where he was basically saying, look, his conclusion is it's very difficult to sort of know early Islamic history in a sense on these sorts of questions.
Yeah, certain events one can agree happened. So yeah. Ali did accept arbitration.
Yeah.
That did not go well for him, and he was defeated and so on. That's beyond question. But some of the details are tricky.
Right. Okay, well, I could keep on asking you questions about this all night, and I think Nebil has done us a service by offering a reading of some fascinating figures, and it really just comes down to me thanking you, Omar, for doing the heavy lifting with the reading as per usual, and taking us through it and discussing it with us, and just I guess to our benefit, Omar is going to be with us for another 3 weeks. Before he's
hopefully I'll live longer than that.
Hopefully, but he'll be sort of joining us again next week to discuss Laura Hassan's book on Saifuddin al-Ahmadi, inshallah, which I'm really looking forward to.
So Ash'arism encounters Avicennism, Saifuddin al-Ahmadi on creation by the Mutakallima, Laura Hassan.
Right.
So that should be fun.
We'll look forward to that. My colleague at Oxford, of course. So I look forward to that, and inshallah, until next week, we will be seeing you. So please do join then. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.